everybody, and welcome to this Kites HR Breakfast Club. This is our fourth HR Breakfast Club of the year and our third webinar. So for some of you, it seems like such a long time ago that we saw you in person at our office in March. And this is our fourth and final Breakfast Club of the year, and like I say, our third webinar. For those who haven't met me before at any of the Kites events, my name's Tom Fairhurst. I'm Marketing Executive at Kites, and I'll be your host for this Breakfast Club for the next hour. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Kites or not attended a HR Breakfast Club before, Kites is an award-winning independent commercial law firm. We're based in Manchester City Centre. And the subject of today's HR Breakfast is mental health in the workplace. And I'll take you through the agenda for this morning shortly. So just to introduce you to our speakers for the day. So we have three speakers from Kites who are here to lend their expertise and insight to you today. So we have Mark McKeating, who's a partner in our employment team. We have Lauren Ogden, who's a solicitor in the employment team. And James Howarth, who's also a solicitor in our employment team. And then our guest speaker today is Maria Mander, and Maria is a health and wellbeing specialist at the Growth Company. And as well as Maria, we're also going to hear from her colleague Thomas Pickford. Thomas is going to talk a little bit about their Skills for Growth SME program and how that may be able to help support your businesses. So just onto this morning's agenda. So we'll just start with a few ways to connect with us moving forward and a short piece of housekeeping. Lauren and James are then going to give us a case law update. James is just going to give us a brief introduction to some recent changes to GDPR. We're then going to hear from Mark. He's going to give us some expert insight on some workplace considerations around disability against the backdrop of COVID. And then our final slot will be Maria, our guest speaker, who's going to talk about managing the mental health of employees. So just to tell you about some ways to connect with us moving forward after this webinar, and to tell you about ways to get in touch if there's any help we can offer you. Obviously, there's contact details on here, email address, Kites website. Just to say that the Kites website has a number of regular insights updated on there, not just employment, but across the variety of different offerings that the firm has. And also through the website, you can join our mailing list as well. We also have three main social media outlets. That's Twitter, LinkedIn, and also YouTube. So again, if you're active on those social media accounts, please follow us. Just to say that this webinar is being recorded and will go out on YouTube after this. And again, the previous HR breakfast that we've had are also on YouTube as well. So for instance, the last one that was on managing redundancy plans, you can find on the Kites YouTube channel with a simple search. And then just some housekeeping. So in terms of follow-up questions, we've got the agenda quite tight today in terms of what we want to talk to you about. So in terms of questions, it would be great if you had any that you could follow up with us afterwards. And there will be a follow-up email straight after this webinar, which will contain information of how to contact us and how to contact each person who's been on the call as well. So if you've got any specific questions that comes out of any of the content today, please don't hesitate to engage with any of the speakers, and I'm sure they'll come back to you in good time. And that's it from me for the introduction. So I just hand over to our employment solicitor, Lauren Ogden, who's going to take you through the first of our case law updates this morning.
Morning, everybody. So the first case that I'm going to discuss with you this morning is a case of Mrs. K. Higgs against Farmers School. This was a case which was recently heard in Bristol Employment Tribunal in September 2020. So the case is about a Mrs. Higgs who was employed as a pastoral support administrator and work experience manager at a school in 2013. In October 2018, it was reported to the school that Mrs. Higgs had shared 2 Facebook posts which openly criticised the teaching of LGBTQ+ relationships and community in schools. She was suspended from her role whilst an investigation took place, and following the investigation and a meeting with Mrs. Higgs, it was decided that she would be dismissed from the school for gross misconduct. Mrs. Higgs then brought a claim for discrimination and harassment. She argued that her dismissal breached her freedom of speech and religion, and that her lack of belief in matters relating to gender fluidity and same-sex marriage and her beliefs relating to unbiblical ideas are promoted, that she should be able to counter those ideas. So the tribunal held that there was no causal link between Mrs. Higgs' beliefs and the way she was treated, and therefore her discrimination claim failed. This was on the basis that the Facebook posts might reasonably lead people to think that she was homophobic and transphobic, rather than it being an expression of her Christian beliefs. This had the potential for a negative impact in relation to various groups of people, namely pupils, parents, staff, and the wider community. Mrs. Higgs' harassment claim also failed. The tribunal heard that whilst the disciplinary process would have been uncomfortable for Mrs. Higgs, it did not have the purpose or effect of violating her dignity or in creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive environment for her. Mrs. Higgs has stated that she wants to appeal, so this is a case that we are going to keep an eye on for the future. Employers should take comfort from this case that they can take action against employees who express views on social media which are discriminatory or cause offence to people with protected characteristics in order to guard the employer's reputation. Any action taken by an employer should be in accordance with policies on equality and social media. So employers should ensure that they have these policies in place and that they set out clear expectations for employees. Then the next case I'm going to discuss with you this morning is Berkeley Catering Limited against Mrs. Jackson. This was a case which was appealed all the way up to the Employment Appeals Tribunal. So the facts of this case are Mrs. Jackson was first employed as a commercial director in the business. In 2016, she was then promoted to managing director. She took over this role from Mr. Patel, who is the owner of the business. In 2017, Mr. Patel began to increase the amount of time he was spending in the business, and Mrs. Jackson claimed that it was at this point that he started to exclude her from her activities. In March 2018, Mr. Patel announced that he was going to be taking over control of management decision-making and operation under the title of CEO, and that the managing director role would therefore be redundant. A month later, Mrs. Jackson was then dismissed for redundancy on the basis that the business's requirements for the employees to carry out work of a particular kind had diminished. Mrs. Jackson then issued a claim for unfair dismissal, stating that Mr. Patel had removed her from her position by placing himself as CEO, and she denied that there was any diminished requirement within the company in respect of her role. In the alternative, she claimed that there was no fair redundancy procedure, and the role of events director, which was offered to a new recruit shortly before her redundancy, would have been a role that was suitable for her. So the first decision in the Employment Tribunal found that Mrs. Jackson had been unfairly dismissed, as the reasons for the dismissal related to Mrs. Jackson as an individual rather than a redundancy situation, and that there was no business reorganisation constituting some other substantial reason for dismissal. Her employer then appealed this, and the Employment Appeals Tribunal overturned the finding that there was no redundancy. It was stated that a redundancy situation either exists or it does not, and it is simply for the tribunal to ask whether there was any diminution in the number of employees required to do the work. The Appeals Tribunal held that the employer had arranged its affairs so that its requirement for employees to carry out the work undertaken by the managing director had diminished, and this had created a redundancy situation. The employer's motive and conduct deliberately undermining the employee's position was relevant only to identifying the reason for the dismissal or any procedural unfairness, not the existence of a redundancy situation. So the case has now been referred back to the tribunal to decide if the redundancy situation is the reason for the dismissal, and if so, was the decision procedurally and substantively reasonable. So we've seen an increase in redundancy situations being challenged. So employers should ensure that they follow the correct procedure and take advice from us where needed. I'm going to hand over to my colleague James now, who will do the third case or update for you.
Thanks, Lauren. So yeah, as Lauren said, so the final case we're going to talk about today is the Court of Appeal case of Robinson versus DWP. So Miss Robinson worked as a administrator in the debt management department of the DWP. Her role required her to use specialist software called Debt Manager. However, in 2014, she was diagnosed as having a rare type of migraine that caused the vision in one of her eyes to blur. This condition was considered a disability under the Equality Act because it severely inhibited her ability to use that software, that Debt Manager software, as well as generally impacted her and her everyday working at the DWP. So the DWP did try and help Ms. Robinson. So what they did is they installed screen magnification software on her systems. However, they took a long time to do this. Also, this raised further issues in that only certain sections of the screen could be magnified at any one point, whereas actually she required the whole screen to be magnified to allow her to work efficiently and effectively. So this caused her stress and ultimately led to a lengthy period of sickness absence. So she brought a grievance against the way that the DWP had handled this whole matter, and that grievance was ultimately upheld. She was moved to a paper-based role at the same grade and received the same pay. However, shortly afterwards, she actually raised a second grievance, this time seeking both compensation and an apology. And that grievance was not upheld. And this led her to start a tribunal claim against the DWP. So she brought two claims under the Equality Act, the first of which is a Section 15 claim in that she had suffered discrimination arising from her disability. The second claim was a bit more straightforward. It was a Section 20 claim in that the DWP had failed to make reasonable adjustments. So the tribunal, although they found that the DWP had actually made reasonable adjustments, they decided that they treated her unfavorably in the way that they both handled the grievance and the delays in making those reasonable adjustments. So what they said was that the DWP had actually discriminated against her due to a disability, discrimination arising from a disability. So the DWP disagreed with this and they appealed the decision, and the Employment Appeal Tribunal decided that the claimant actually hadn't been discriminated against. She disagreed with this, and the case got heard by the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal dismissed the claim. So what they said was the original tribunal had taken the complete wrong approach with regard to the Section 15 claim. What they said was, for Section 15 claim to succeed, the treatment suffered must be as a consequence of the disability. So discrimination claims like this require a tribunal to decide that the tribunal must find that the unfavourable treatment was because of the disability. It's not enough for a claimant just to say, but for my disability, the unfair treatment would not have occurred. You can see there's a slight distinction between the two. So looking at this case, if you looked at the managers and the decision makers and their motivations and mindsets at the time of what they did, the reason they acted the way they acted wasn't because of her disability. It was just poor management. Therefore, this claim had to fail. So there's kind of two takeaways really from this. Firstly, I think it's always worth saying that the motivations and mindsets of a manager in any discrimination case will always be relevant, to say, always worth bearing that in mind. And secondly, this really clarifies what was a grey area of law. It's really clear now that the treatment suffered must be because of the disability. There must be that link between the two. I think ultimately that makes it a bit more difficult for an employee to bring a claim like that. So the final thing I'm going to talk about, and on to the next slide, if you might mind, thanks Tom. So the final thing I'm going to talk about is to do with an update from the ICO. So on the 21st of October, the ICO published updated guidance with regards to data subject access requests. So it's a fairly lengthy document, it's about 80 pages long, but I think it's worth reading really. especially because as a team, what we've seen is a real influx in requests to help with subject access requests. It just seems like it's common practice now that any employee dispute is accompanied by a subject access request, whereas the employee is trying to find either information that's going to help their claim or find any kind of data that might undermine any employer defence. So there's just three things I'm going to touch upon from that guidance. The first of which is with regards to timeframes. So as we all probably know, that generally you have a month to comply with a subject access request. Obviously, there are circumstances where you can extend that, and technically you should be complying without unreasonable delay, but generally the month time frame tends to stand. However, what this guidance now says is you can actually stop the clock on that time limit where the actual employee has not been clear on what they're requiring from a subject access request. So technically, if an employee makes a request and it's not clear what they're looking to obtain, then you can actually stop that clock and not start that time frame until you've asked them and they've clarified it. So that, I suppose that's good to know. Secondly, there's further guidance on what's considered to be a reasonable fee to charge for subject access requests. So as you may know, that there's certain circumstances where you can actually charge a fee for a subject access request. What this guidance now says is that fee will include administration costs, staff costs and equipment costs. What I would say is it's still quite a high bar really if you're looking to charge a fee to comply with a subject access request. The ICO expects you as an employer to have systems in place that let you comply with an employee's subject access request relatively straightforwardly. And the final update is to do an exemption under the subject access request. So again, you may or may not know this, that you can refuse to comply with a subject access request where the request is either excessive or manifestly unfounded. So I think previously it's always been considered very rare, or if ever, would you actually try and rely on such a request, because again, as I said before, you should have systems in place. But what I think this update shows is the ICO expects there to be certain circumstances where these exemptions will apply, and expect an employer to actually refuse to comply in certain circumstances. So again, I think it very much depends on the context, but it's some comfort to know that exemption may apply in certain circumstances. So the final thing I'm going to say is, and I suppose you'd expect me to say this, I'd certainly recommend seeking appropriate legal advice when you get a subject access request. And that can be anything from just having an initial call just to understand what the actual search parameters are, and have a call with the employees who actually undertake that search, just to make sure this process is as streamlined as possible, because I appreciate subject access requests can be very time consuming, but actually it could be a bit more extensive than that. So it could be a case of a lawyer looking through all the data, undertaking a redaction process and a SIF process to actually provide a sanitized version of that data that you can disclose, along with any accompanying documentation that you need to provide. And I say this because I suppose there's two really reasons. Firstly, I suppose you don't want to fail in your obligations, your data protection obligations, and find yourself on the wrong end of an ICO complaint. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, you don't want to find yourself disclosing information that you don't have to disclose under a subject access request, because in certain circumstances it is quite limited. So I'd certainly recommend seeking appropriate advice so you don't disclose anything that potentially might harm any defence that you might have. So that was relatively brief, but that's it for the update now. So I'll hand over to Mark. Thank you.
Thanks for that, James. Morning, everyone. Hope everyone is keeping safe out there. So I'm going to be looking at disability discrimination in the context of COVID. It goes without saying that COVID has had a real profound effect on everyone's lives and will continue to do so over the coming weeks, months, possibly a year ahead. Tommy, on the first slide. So what I'm going to be looking at today, some talking points: whether a person who contracts the virus qualifies as a disabled person, whether grief could qualify as a disability, and finally I'm going to touch on mental health. So as a reminder, it's probably worth going back to the legal definition of a disabled person, which is set out in Section 6 of the Equality Act. And this refers to a physical or mental impairment, in which the impairment has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on the person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So picking up on the word substantial, that means more than minor, more than trivial. In terms of long-term, what we're looking at is a condition that lasts or could last 12 months or more. And if a condition is controlled by medication, you need to consider the effects of the condition without the medication. So let's start with whether a person who contracts the virus can qualify as a disabled person. I think for many, some will be asymptomatic or will have very mild effects. That's unlikely to amount to the definition we've just touched on. But for others, may have long-lasting effects. Certainly anyone that is in hospital and receiving treatment, it's likely that they will qualify as a disabled person. Equally, anyone that is suffering from long COVID, so symptoms of fatigue, shortness of breath, perhaps a loss of smell, is again likely to amount to a disabled person. So these are things employers just need to have in mind when they do take steps in the workplace to manage issues. Tom, next one. Now, could grief qualify as a disability? And Tom, you just flip the slide. Now, today, I did check the figures, and sadly, in excess of 60,000 people have lost their lives. So it has, again, really impacted a lot of people. A lot of people's families have lost loved ones. Grief in itself could potentially amount to a disability, and it's worth considering this case that was reported this year. It's a case of Igweki and TSB Bank. And the employee in this case brought a number of claims related to both disability and race discrimination. But the one interesting aspect is the claim for unlawful deduction of wages. Here, the employee had been off work for a couple of months, had suffered a close family bereavement, had come back to work, and by his own admissions had been off track in terms of performance. Now, he missed out on the performance threshold to gain a bonus, and he lost out on the bonus. Others were paid a bonus. So he brought a claim on the basis of the only reason I've lost out on my bonus is because of the knock-on impact of this bereavement. It just affected me. It's affected me long-term, and it certainly had a substantial impact. But the tribunal rejected that. They said, this is not a disability. A grief reaction following a close bereavement is not necessarily the manifestation of a mental impairment, but an ordinary human reaction to a life event. The claimant appealed that decision, and the Employment Appeals Tribunal rejected that approach that the tribunal took. And they said that you're best served by first considering the long-term substantial adverse effect. So essentially you need to ask yourself whether the employee's performance was affected, and that could be by looking at the employee's performance a year before, or even a comparison against the employee's peers, how well they did. Now, if there is a significant drop in performance, and we're talking about 50% or more, as opposed to maybe a modest fluctuation in performance, then it's likely that they have had a substantial adverse effect. So I've just quoted from the judge in the EAT, Judge Oerbach, who said, the starting point is to look at the effect on the individual and form a view about whether it is more than minor or trivial. So the tribunal had simply looked at the fact that the employee had been off for a couple of months and wouldn't necessarily impact the employee's ability to get back on track again. But the tribunal said, well, we have to look at more than that. You have to look at actually how substantial that impact has been over the course of 5 or 6 months going into the back end of the performance bonus year. So just to kind of red flag that potentially bereavement or grief could amount to a disability, and you need to be aware of that when managing any such issues in the workplace. So next one, please. So we're going to look at mental health. Our guest speaker, Maria Mander, will talk more about actually managing employees' mental health. But clearly, mental health has been associated with COVID, with the lockdown. People are being affected by working remotely, perhaps being isolated from their colleagues, feelings of loneliness. Anyone might have caught the data produced by the NHS digital team this week that said in the first 3 months of the pandemic, fit notes, 40% of those fit notes recorded mental health as a reason for absence. So it clearly is an issue that is perhaps exacerbated by COVID. Tom, if you could just flip the slide. And ACAS carried out an interesting survey as well. Again, this was carried out during the pandemic. And it found that nearly 2 out of 5 employees working from home felt stressed, anxious, or experienced some form of mental health. 1 in 2 people working from home felt isolated. 7 out of 10 felt they were missing out on social interactions with work colleagues. And this theme was picked up by the government in their winter plan that was published at the end of November, where they encouraged employers to, whilst the rule is that if you can work from home, you ought to work from home. But the government in this paper were saying, well, actually, if you've got employees that are working remotely and are suffering from a mental health point of view, then you might want to consider whether you can accommodate them back in the workplace again, just to assist with improving mental health amongst employees. So it's a very good resource if, as an employer, you're getting some pushback, if you're trying to bring more people back into the workplace that have been working remotely. This winter plan is quite a useful tool that employers can rely on to say, well, actually, it might be in your interest to come back for the purposes of just maintaining healthy minds. Obviously, goes without saying that any workplace should continue to be COVID secure. Health and Safety Executive have also published a useful talking toolkit, 21-page guide, quite user-friendly, that talks about some things that employers might want to do to just improve working conditions for those that are perhaps at risk of suffering from mental health. So in terms of mental health, a person suffering from depression or anxiety can qualify as a disabled person. It's a mental impairment. The difficulty for an employer can be actually to spot that. So if it's something physical, like a broken leg, then you can see that clearly there's an impairment. But unless the employee comes forward and tells you, I'm suffering, or submits a fit note that records mental health, it can actually be quite difficult to tell that there is an issue. Some telltale signs for employers could be the fact that there is a long absence record that's maybe linked to depression or anxiety, perhaps a drop in performance, which is completely unusual, or just terms of behavioural patterns from the employees. So again, these are things you should look out for. And it's important because there's a positive obligation to consider reasonable adjustments. So if you have actual or constructive knowledge that an employee may be a disabled person, it does place a legal obligation on an employer to consider reasonable adjustments. Now that's not an easy question to address, and it may be that employers will need some assistance from a medical expert. So it may mean a referral to occupational health for comments on what reasonable adjustments they ought to consider, or even the employee's own GP. Ultimately, what we're looking at for reasonable adjustments is removing or reducing any disadvantage on the employee because of their disability. It is a balancing act. So for the employer, it has to be practical, it has to be affordable, and certainly can't cause any risk to anyone else's health and safety. So if you take mental health as an example, in terms of a reasonable adjustment, that could be an employer reviewing the working arrangements. It could be providing one-to-one support, maybe a mentor, additional training, or even a phased return to work, in some cases be reasonable. So in terms of areas of concern that we're seeing in the team, a lot of it is around working arrangements. It may mean perhaps just trying to think about potential impact on certain groups. So if there is a strict requirement for employees to return to work on a full-time basis, then that potentially could disadvantage some employees that are suffering from mental health. And what comes with that is, again, considering some reasonable adjustments, so perhaps a phased return to work. Also underperformance. So employers that are now starting to ramp up formal performance improvement plans, again, they should be just mindful of any underperformance that is related to any disability, again, mental health in mind. Also absences. If an employer is perhaps taking action, disciplinary action, including dismissal for poor absence record, the employer just needs to be satisfied that none of the absences are related to disability, which could potentially result in a disability discrimination claim. Tribunal claims, it's highly likely we will see a lot of these claims come through. We are seeing complaints, whether it be in the form of grievances. Disability discrimination claims can be very expensive. Certainly if you lose, tribunals have the power to award both injury to feelings and loss of earnings. The compensatory cap as well of 88,500 is removed if there is a positive finding of discrimination. In terms of the latest stats we have from the tribunal, the highest award this year was 266,000. So these claims are expensive and can be costly and can just have a debilitating effect on a business, which at this time is probably the last thing an employer will want. So managing disability is key for any business at the moment, particularly when it comes to mental health. And with that, I'm going to pass over to our guest speaker. I'm delighted that she has agreed to come along and speak for everyone. Maria Mander is an expert in wellbeing, and she's going to talk us through managing mental health of employees. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for the most useful insights there as well. So welcome everybody. It's great to be with you all here today and to talk about managing mental health in the workplace. So if I was to ask you now how you are and how have you been during the pandemic, what would your answer be? And I'm sure if I asked you all, I would get different answers from everybody because it's been a difficult time and challenged people in many ways. The mental health of the workforce has deteriorated during the pandemic, and Mind has said that 1 in 5 people who had no prior mental health issues now feel that their mental health is either poor or very poor. And Mind have also stated that 60% of people have said that their mental health has worsened during lockdown. So talking to you all today as leaders, managers and HR professionals, you have also had a really challenging time in managing businesses, and a lot of businesses have actually been in survival mode. And mental health at work have actually stated that 62% of managers have had to put the needs of the business first before the well-being of employees. So just on to the next slide, Tom. So these are some of the issues that employees are experiencing at the moment because of the pandemic. The first one is burnout, really starting to see a lot of this now, which is emotional, mental and physical exhaustion. And this has been caused by a lot of employees having to work for a prolonged period of time under stress during the pandemic, and a lot of employees have not actually taken annual leave as well this year because they've not been able to go away on holiday because of the restrictions. So this is something to be mindful of because it's now recognised as a medical condition by the World Health Organization. So it's looking out for those signs if your employees are struggling. We've also got a lot of anxiety, a lot of people suffering from depression, and there's a lot of fear around as well. Some people have actually got underlying health conditions, so there's a fear that they may contract COVID. We've also got a fear of job loss. There's an uncertain future, and a lot of people have got financial difficulties and money worries at the moment. Maybe their partner has lost a job. So these are some of the issues, as well as sadly bereavement. So this has impacted people in a way where they've not been able to give their loved ones a send-off. And, you know, we've not got that human contact at the moment as well, where we can give people a hug as well. So this is another thing that's affected people. Then we've also seen an increase in domestic abuse as well. So this is quite a taboo subject and something that we feel uncomfortable about, but it's recognising those signs. And this isn't something that affects women, it actually affects men as well. And this can be not only physical abuse, but emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and also financial as well, where somebody's actually controlling their finances. And then the last one is probably something that we can all relate to, is we've all developed some unhealthy habits during this time, which are going to be hard nuts to crack. And I'm sure for most of us, we now have a new wardrobe of elasticated pants in the wardrobe. But, you know, a lot of people have been snacking a lot because they are now working remotely from home. So this is going to lead to an increase in obesity, heart disease. So this is something we need to be aware of. And also there's been an increase as well in people, you know, drinking more alcohol at home. And again, that's going to have a long-term impact and could cause liver damage and also alcoholism as well. Next slide, please, Tom. Another issue we've had is actually supporting our employees that have actually been furloughed during this time. So as a duty of care as an employer, we still need to make sure that we're looking after the mental and physical health of employees that have been furloughed. So making sure that you're signposting them to support. Maybe you've got an employee assistance program. A lot of those programs also have counselling sessions as well. Or maybe signposting them externally to other organisations if they're struggling with the mental well-being, for example, the Samaritans or Mind. So communication is absolutely key. And by communicating effectively with furloughed employees ensures their engagement and loyalty, and also ensures a smooth transition back to work as well. Another thing that you can do to support furloughed employees is to they can go and volunteer in the community, which supports their mental well-being, and also they can do training in this time as well. So think of there any training opportunities where they could upskill, learn something new, so they're challenged. It boosts their self-esteem and it also boosts their confidence as well. Next slide, Tom. So we've also got the issue of redundancy and making sure that this is managed in a way with empathy, that managers feel comfortable in having those conversations. It's a very emotional time right now, and it's making sure that employees are treated with compassion, dignity and respect as they're taken through this process. And also as well, reassuring them that they're a very valued employee and that redundancy is no way a reflection upon their performance. So communication is absolutely key, making sure that you have those two-way conversations which are very honest and very authentic. And again, signposting them to any support, employee assistance lines, maybe occupational health, and also external helplines as well. And then also providing outplacement services as well. So, you know, can you support them with redrafting their CVs, refreshing their interview skills, helping with social media skills, and also channels for seeking a new job. And I've actually put some useful resources on for you here, which is Employee GM and GC Employment, which are two organisations which can help upskill your employees and also help them to find a job. And the last link is CIPD have a really good toolkit for managers managing redundancy. Next slide, please, Tom. So to manage the well-being of our employees takes a holistic approach, and that means that we have to have a well-being strategy. So according to the CIPD Health and Wellbeing report back in March, it states that only 44% of organisations actually have a wellbeing strategy. And I think COVID's now shone a big light on wellbeing, on how important it is, because if you've got a well and thriving and healthy workforce that are resilient, they're going to be more productive, they're going to be high performing, and ultimately have a positive impact on your bottom line profit. So first of all, we've spoken a lot about mental health, but one thing that we don't realise is that physical health is very much intertwined with mental health. So it's making sure that you're encouraging your employees to exercise every day. We've got a lot of remote workers now, so a lot of people are actually sedentary every day. So it's making sure people are not sat at laptops for 8 or 9 hours a day, and that they're encouraged to go and take exercise. And especially now in winter, when we've got dark mornings and dark evenings, it's harder to get motivated. So encouraging people to go outside, get some fresh air, be in nature, and that also tops up our vitamin D levels. And it's been noted that a lot of COVID patients actually lack vitamin D. And then it's also making sure we're encouraging good nutrition during this time. I think if there's one time we need to invest in our well-being, it's actually now during this pandemic. And again, making sure we're not snacking and eating unhealthy things, but eating well, which also sustains our energy levels for performance at work as well. One of the key things that actually underpins all of our well-being is sleep. So we should actually get 7 to 9 hours of unbroken sleep every night. The Sleep Council has said that 43% of people have actually struggled with their sleep during the pandemic. And I think many of us today have probably woken up at 4 in the morning and not been able to get back to sleep. It's really interrupted our sleep. And I think a lot of that is there's so much uncertainty and of an undercurrent of what's coming next. And we've had many restrictions, that's really had an impact, and sleep really impacts on your well-being and your performance at work as well. So supporting mental health in the workplace, making sure that you've got trained mental health first aiders which act as first line support to support employees. Also have a wellbeing committee, recruit wellbeing champions so that they can create that awareness and create that culture of wellbeing, and also drive initiatives for you as well. Wellbeing certainly needs to be driven by the leaders right from the top, right through down into the organisation. And it's also making sure that your managers have the basic training so that they can spot signs, and they also feel comfortable in having conversations with their employees. I think as managers going forward, we are going to need a new skill set almost, where we have to lead with more empathy and be authentic as well. Then we have social. This is absolutely key and really ties in with mental health. So it's making sure that as we've got, hybrid working places now, that those employees working remotely, we're keeping connected with them. We've got team meetings and doing activities and things, which is going to be unique to each organisation. Some people might want to do a lunchtime meditation or an after work yoga class. Some people might want to have, a beer and pizza and have a quiz. So it's just making sure that you think of ways where you can stay connected to your employees. And that's also being connected to the wider community as well. Financial wellbeing is going to be a huge topic next year. And a lot of organisations are already starting to have workshops to educate employees how to manage their finances, and also signposts to external organisations such as Citizens Advice, mortgage lenders, and also employee assistance programs also have some useful advice as well. A lot of people are going to be getting into debt and have money worries, and that has a huge impact on mental well-being. And then our working environment as well. So again, as a lot of people are now working from home, have they got the right setup? Are they working from laptops, sat on a sofa, hunched over all day? So it's making sure, they've got the right equipment and the working environment to support their well-being. Next slide, please, Tom. So to back up your wellbeing strategy, I recommend having a programme of initiatives which you could have different themes each month. And starting from January now, when we all start to set health goals, this is a really great time to kick that off. So I've used the 5 Ways to Wellbeing by the New Economics Foundation as a guide for you to drive those initiatives in the workplace. So number 1, I think, is absolutely key for me, and that's connect. So it's making sure that you're driving those wellbeing messages through all of your company comms, your updates, team meetings, signposting to information on the intranet, and also using tools such as Slack as well. So making sure you've got those strong lines of communication, and also sharing positive news as well. I've got to a stage where I don't watch the news anymore. Give me some positive news, like, for example, the vaccine, and then I'll watch it. So please make sure that we're spreading lots of positivity at this time as well. And then be active. So we can do simple things that, don't have to cost companies anything. So be creative. Can you have one-to-ones with your employees and have them as a walking meeting, where you have a meeting over the phone to encourage people, again, to get outdoors and exercise? A lot of organisations have introduced a golden hour. So they're saying between 12 and 1, no meetings, and it's a time where we're encouraging employees to get outdoors, do some exercise, or maybe just pick the phone up, connect with people. So again, that's another simple, cost-effective idea. Another thing we have to be mindful of, I'm noticing now that we're becoming a culture of back-to-back Zoom and team meetings. So it's being aware of this as well, that we've got breaks in between our meetings, or reduced meeting times. So starting a meeting at 5 past the hour, finishing at 5:02, so you've got a 10-minute gap. So that's something to be aware of as well. So I think one of the things that the pandemic has done, it's made us almost stop and reset and pause and kind of look at our life. So I think we've been a bit more mindful. People are starting to, get out into nature more, noticing their surroundings, noticing how we are having an impact, on our planet as well. And then it's also being self-aware. So, having daily check-ins with yourself and promoting those messages of self-care and how to look after yourself as well. I think that's really important. So with wellbeing, it's encouraging employees to be responsible, for their own health. Some organisations have now been giving wellbeing days or mental health days. So say, for example, giving employees 2 days, so that if they're feeling that they're really struggling or they're overwhelmed, they can have that time off to take some time out. Also, make sure that you're encouraging employees to take annual leave. What we're seeing now is a lot of people are finishing very early for Christmas and taking a huge amount of time off. So making sure that employees are taking regular breaks throughout the year, which will help maintain their well-being. And again, as we've spoken about, making sure that you're signposting to support. Organisations now have also been re-evaluating what benefits they add. So some things may be more relevant now. For example, people want access to online GP services, or they want discounts on things or cashback schemes and offers. The next one is learning. So as I mentioned before, learning a new skill really boosts self-esteem and confidence. So this is something that supports well-being as well. And I've also set a goal in there, because we need something to look forward to as human beings. So whether that's a goal personally, or it could be a company goal where you plan to get together maybe later on next year. Hopefully we'll be restriction free by then. And then the last one is give. So giving you time, that's the most free thing, the most important thing that you can do right now, is giving you time to listen to somebody. And also being kind to your colleagues. I am noticing now that we're getting towards the end of the year and Christmas, people are starting to feel a little bit frazzled. So just making sure that you're aware of your emotions and showing kindness and empathy to your colleagues and the people around you. A lot of people, for employee engagement and to show their appreciation and how they're valued, have actually been sending gifts. So they've been sending wellbeing packages through the post, brew in a box to encourage you to talk to other people. Some companies have been sending advent calendars, and I've also known one company that are providing Christmas meals for their employees as well. And then the last one is volunteer in your community to give something back. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to repeat a lot of these because Mark's gone through them. So just to be aware of the Equality Act, HSE have a really great toolkit for looking at stress around work-related activities, and they now have a talking toolkit for managers as well to aid them in having those conversations. Also, ACAS promotes positive mental health at work and have a great toolkit. And a lot of companies have been signed up to the Time to Change pledge, which was a great tool to get people talking about mental health and creating that awareness within organisations. But unfortunately, it's run out of funding. So they're now only going to have the Time to Change Day in February. So I recommend the Mental Health at Work commitment, which is a new national platform that was launched last October, and it's based on the Thriving at Work standards. So a lot of big organisations have actually signed up to this. So that's one to consider as well. Next slide, please. So Christmas is going to be quite an emotional time this year for a lot of people. So it's just making sure that you've got something in place to support your employees over the festive period. There is so much support out there now for employees. The NHS has got a great wealth of information on their website, and an A to Z of illnesses and also organisations that you can contact. Mind also has an A to Z of illnesses and has useful resources and tools on there as well, including a wellbeing action plan. Then we've got helplines by Mind for Samaritans. We've also got Calm, which is aimed at men to prevent suicide. So please make sure that you're signposting people to support over the festive period. So that's it from me. I hope you've got some useful information there to take back to your organisation to make sure that you create a holistic approach for your wellbeing strategy to deal with the issues and also put preventative measures in place as well. So I wish you all a safe and a well Christmas and a prosperous 2021, and make sure that you take some time out yourself to look after your well-being this Christmas. I'm going to pass you over to my colleague Tom, and Tom's going to explain about the services available to support your workforce, and included in that is health and wellbeing consultancy for your organisation, as well as workshops and one-to-one coaching as well. And Tom will also provide my contact details at the end. So it's been a pleasure to be with you all this morning, and I'm now going to pass you over to Tom. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Some really helpful tips there. So myself and Maria, as she mentioned there, are part of a fully funded programme of support called the Skills for Growth SME. So this is available support for SME businesses under 250 full-time employees that have a trading address in Greater Manchester. And what this support is, it's aimed at identifying current and future skills gaps that are available to employers. So we'd be looking to work with businesses, understand what their growth ambitions are, understand what challenges they're facing at the moment, what hard to fill roles are, what barriers to growth they have in place at the moment, and then working with the individual employees, doing training needs analysis, understanding what skills they currently have within the organisation and what skills they would need to have in place to meet those future organisational ambitions. So we're then going to be working with skill providers within the Greater Manchester area, both funded and unfunded, to address those needs of the employers. So as Maria said, there are other support that is available for the employers during this programme of support. So there's the Health and Wellbeing Specialist, which Maria has just mentioned. We also have apprenticeship specialists to help employers guide through the absolute minefield of apprenticeship standards that are available at the moment, and understand out of the training needs analysis for employees, which employees would be suitable for apprenticeships, the programmes, and what they would be. We also have business change specialists as well, And these are people that can come into an organization and help put a strategy in place for adapting the product to a new market, being able to pivot and change and bring a new line or service to market as well. So all this package of support is fully funded, and it's available through the European Social Fund, which me and Maria are both part of, which is called the Skills for Growth Programme. So on the next slide, if you can, please, Tom, if you want to find out more about the Skills for Growth Programme, please visit our website, which is just skillsforgrowthsme.co.uk, or you can email Maria, which is Maria Mander at growthco.uk, and she can put you in touch with a skills coach and tell you a little bit more about the programme. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that. So that's our HR breakfast for this morning. Thank you everybody for attending. Obviously I want to say a big thanks to our speakers. So the speakers from Kites, Lauren, James and Mark, whose contact details are on the screen now. And obviously a huge thanks to Tom and Maria as well. That was a real fascinating insight. So yeah, just to say finally, to finish up, that there will be a follow-up email coming out on the back of this webinar. Within that email, there will be everybody's contact details who's spoken on the webinar today. There'll also be a link to a survey on there. We'd really appreciate if you could engage with that. That survey is just asking you about what you thought about this webinar, but also an opportunity there to put forward topics that you might like to learn more about and have more content on within these webinars in the future. And there'll also be a link on that email as well to sign up to our mailing list, so you'll get all up-to-date insights and news from us at Kite. And just to say, as I mentioned at the start, this webinar has been recorded, and we will send the recording out to this webinar as well in a separate email. Again, if you've got any friends or colleagues who you think might find this really useful and find the content from today really engaging, then please feel free to send that on to them. And that just leaves me to say thank you very much for attending. The next HR breakfast will be in March 2021. Hopefully we're not too far off being able to invite you back to the Kites office again for one of our HR breakfasts. We'd love to see you back very soon. And just to say, I hope everybody keeps well. If we don't speak to you before, have a great Christmas and New Year. And we look forward to inviting you to another Kites event in 2021. So thank you for everybody for attending.